Welcome to What is Going Om, for new thought from the edge of Om. Each week on OMTimes' flagship radio show, veteran broadcaster, author, and media consultant Sandie Sedgbeer conducts thought-provoking interviews with inspirational authors, artists, musicians, scientists, speakers, and filmmakers who are working at the point where spirituality and science meet consciousness at the very edge of Om. Here is your host, Sandie Sedgbeer.
Hello. It's been said that how we approach death can greatly affect how we live. There's no denying that the fear, grief and pain of losing loved ones can be paralyzing, but we cannot escape it. We're all going to experience the deaths of people we love, and in turn, the people we love will experience the pain and grief of losing us. Clare Goldsberry is a lifelong student of religion and a spiritual seeker who's embraced an eclectic form of theology that spans Hinduism, Buddhism, the philosophies of the ancient wisdom teachers, and the science of quantum physics. Her journey has included working with elderly people and those suffering from illness whose beliefs and fears about death and dying often cause grave suffering. And she's also helped her partner Brent through 18 months of living with and eventually dying from esophageal cancer. Clare Goldsberry joins me today to discuss her latest book, The Illusion of Life and Death, Mind, Consciousness and Eternal Being, which draws on her insights as a Buddhist practitioner, her studies of Christianity and ageless wisdom, and her partner's cancer journey, to provide a profound picture of what living fearlessly and dying gracefully means for all of us. Clare Goldsberry, welcome.
Thank you. I appreciate you having me on your show today.
Clare, religion and spiritual traditions have interested you since very early childhood, and your path has taken you in many different directions, from mainline Protestantism to a 10-year odyssey through Mormonism, back into Christianity, and finally into practicing Buddhism and the study of Hindu philosophy. What do you think fueled that really early interest in religious and spiritual traditions? What was it that you were seeking?
Well, I think early on, I was just curious. I was, of course, raised in Protestant Christianity, and there were a lot of questions that I always had, and I just wanted answers. As a teenager, I talked to my minister one day, and I was asking him questions, and he said, the problem with you, Claire, is you have too many questions that nobody can really answer. So I guess I was on this quest to, like many of us are, to find answers. We want to know, what is the truth? What is the truth about life? And more specifically, what is the truth about death? We're told, as Christians, well, if you're good, you die, you'll go to heaven. But nobody ever said what heaven is, where heaven is, what goes to heaven, what endures after death. In fact, death was rarely even spoken of. And so when I was confronted with Brent's esophageal cancer diagnosis, it didn't seem to bother him. He just said, this should be another excellent adventure. But I was really stunned by it. I'd never known anybody who'd had cancer or died of cancer, and so this was really a shock to me. And I think that one of the big questions that we all have as human beings is, what happens after we die? And is there any meaning to our life?
Yeah. Well, we are going to be discussing all of these things as we move through the show. First, I want to ask, what did you find in Buddhism that you didn't find elsewhere?
I think the primary thing was the answers, or at least for me, what I considered the thing that made sense was the idea of why are we in the position, in this life, in these situations, in this circumstance, that other people aren't. When I was a teenager listening to a missionary group talking about the people they were helping in Africa, and this was many years ago, this was back in the early 1960s, and I listened to them and I looked at the slides. They brought slides of the people that they were helping, the children that were just in really bad shape over there who needed so much. And I began thinking, why them there and why me here? What's the difference? Because I'd been raised to believe that God loves everybody equally. So if God loves us all the same, then why do they have the life they have? And why do I have the life I have? And I think that Buddhism answered that for me when I started learning about karma and reincarnation, which are two sides of the same coin. They're very it's very critical to know not only about karma but about reincarnation, and that started me on the path to understanding more about this than I ever learned in Christianity. And I think for me that was the important thing, is, why my life here and your life there, and what's the difference?
Well, if any religion or, traditional wisdom teaching is going to prepare one for death, it would be Buddhism. Did you find when your partner, Brent, was diagnosed with cancer that you were, you fell apart less than somebody else might because of your beliefs?
Yes, I think that's very true. It took me, a few days to really grasp this idea, because I was fairly new to Buddhist studies. I had only been studying it for about 10 years when he got the diagnosis, and so it took me a while to pull myself back on center and turn all of this intellectual knowledge, the meditations we did at the Buddhist Center, meditations on our own death, a lot of talk about death and dying, a lot of, the idea that you must remember death. Remembering death helps you have a better life. And so it took me a little while to kind of get back on track, but it really confronted me then with the reality. You can know something intellectually. You can read about it, you can meditate on it, you can study it, but until you're really confronted with it, face to face, it's almost like seeing the specter of death face to face. That's when you really start to be, really start to be confronted with this idea and really start going, how much of this do I really believe? How is this going to help me day to day to day to really get through this? And yes, it helped tremendously. Once I kind of got my feet under me, and yes, okay, now I can do this, and I think that was the big thing for me.
And you must also have learned many wonderful things from going through that experience with Brent.
Yes, it was. They gave him 6 months to a year to live if he had all the treatments. If he had the surgery, they wanted to do the chemotherapy, the surgery, then more chemotherapy and radiation, and he just rejected it all. And I think the big thing that I learned was, this idea of living fearlessly. I think we don't know how to die very well in the Western world. I think that has a lot to do with, obviously, our religious background, the way we were raised. And that was the big lesson, to live fearlessly, because he rejected all of that and decided he wanted to do it his way. And he had surgery, but that's all he wanted to do. And he wanted to just live his life. And so instead of only being alive for another 6 months or maybe a year at the outside, he lived for 18 months. And we had a great time. We traveled, he worked, he continued to work. And it really taught me a lot about fearlessness in the face of death, because he was absolutely fearless. and friends and business colleagues just couldn't believe the way he faced this with such openness and mostly with such humor. And I think he taught all of us a lot. All of us who knew him learned a lot from his fearlessness in the face of death.
It's interesting, isn't it, how when a situation like that, I mean, it really does hit other people because all of their fears come to the surface, and they cannot compute how someone cannot be fearful. You talk in the book about how even many of the doctors found it difficult to deal with, that, you know, he was so fearless and he was so still laughing about it in some respects.
Right. And that was interesting to me that that just dealing with the doctors, I mean, they truly did not know what to do with his attitude, with my attitude. I attended most of his medical appointments with him. And it was interesting because one doctor was so amazed with his attitude. Toward the end of his life, he was just, you know, how can you feel this way? This particular doctor was Jewish, and he was very curious about my belief system. Brent really didn't have a religious belief system. He was just, I think, naturally fearless in his life, and it's just the way he was. I had to learn it all. And when I explained some of the Buddhist ideas, philosophies to this doctor, he was so interested in it that he actually took a class up at Mayo Clinic it was given by a Buddhist monk to learn more about death and dying and to get a better perspective on death and the dying process so that he would be more able to help his patients confront this. Because as I found out, death is not something doctors want to talk about. So it really helps to know something about death and dying. And I think if the patients understood it better, maybe we would all be better off.
Yeah. You say that he never thought of himself as sick or as having cancer. He didn't use the word. He went back to work as a sales manager. He dealt with his clients, very jovial manner, and loved driving his Corvette, and wouldn't go to any support groups because he didn't want to be associated with that whole belief system of having cancer, as it were.
Right. He always said they would give him a phone call now and then and go, hey, we've got this support group going for people who are terminal, and he never thought of himself as terminal. He would say, you know, like, well, we're all terminal. I mean, you know, the minute you're born, you're terminal, you know. And he just wouldn't buy into it. He just felt like, he said, well, I have cancer. The cancer doesn't have me. And he felt like that going to these support groups where people sit around and talk about cancer, talk about, you know, being sick and so forth, he just felt like that he didn't relate to that. He didn't want to be in that space. He wanted to be in the space where he was working, where he considered himself well. He considered himself healthy. And so he just rejected all of that. And I think sometimes we're better off because our thoughts do create our reality. We attract the thing. Sometimes we attract the thing we fear the most because we have this thought about it all the time. Yeah. And so I personally believe that thoughts are creative. And so what we create with our thoughts becomes our reality.
Yes.
And so if we want a good life, if we want a healthy life, we need to have right thought.
Yeah. You interweave stories of going through the process, things that Brent was experiencing, things that you were learning from his experiences, with an awful lot of research with quantum science, etc. And it's a beautiful weave. the whole thing about consciousness is something that I think we all need to learn a lot more about. And one of the things you say is that you never, he just went through different stages of consciousness. He was in one consciousness and then he was in another consciousness. He was never unconscious. It was just a flow from one state to the next. So tell us a little bit about that.
Well, from studying the quantum sciences, there's many wonderful books that sort of parallel Buddhist philosophy and Hindu philosophy with the quantum sciences about consciousness and why we are never unconscious. We are just conscious on different levels. I think toward the end of Brent's life, particularly the last couple of weeks after he had quit work and was really ready to go, he would often visualize or have these visions of different levels of consciousness. Sometimes he was even confused about where he was, because consciousness is, there's sleeping, dreaming, dying, and those three levels of consciousness we're very aware of here on the physical plane. But there were times when he was confused about exactly where he was. I know one time I was sitting back here in my office, and we had the hospital bed in the family room, and he called out to me. So I went out to him and asked him what he needed, and he said, "Am I dead yet?" And I said, "No, not yet." In fact, I said, "If you have to ask me whether or not you're dead, you're probably not dead." And he kind of smiled, because he was seeing another level of consciousness, so he wasn't sure, am I still on this level of consciousness? Am I on another level of consciousness? And I think knowing about consciousness, not just from a secular point of view, but say from the quantum physicist point of view and from a Buddhist or Hindu point of view, what is consciousness? Awareness. What is it we are aware of? How are we aware? And how does our awareness change on different levels? Sleeping, dreaming, even dying. What kind of a change do we go through on these levels of consciousness? And I think knowing about that helps us understand what life is and how we create life, create the life we have. And I think it's so important to study what consciousness is, which is why it is included in the subtitle of the book, because we do need to understand what is mind. Mind is what is beyond anything we see here. It's a very subtle entity. It's a very subtle essence. And how does mind contribute to consciousness? I think that's all very important, because if we don't know how to live, we certainly don't know how to die. And I think knowing about mind and consciousness are two very important aspects of the spiritual journey for all of us.
Indeed. You write that watching Brent die, you came to believe that the dying process has purpose. Say more about that.
Well, in the world we live in today, there's a lot of talk about euthanasia, assisted death, doctor-assisted death, and should doctors have the right to help someone die when they feel like their life is of no longer any purpose? And I used to be kind of part of that crowd, as it were, that thought, yes, we need to implement assisted suicide or doctor-assisted death, because that certainly, from my belief, that certainly someone's decision should they wish that. And not everybody gets the opportunity to go through this whole dying process as described in the Tibetan Book of Living and Dying, which was very helpful to me when Brent was going through the dying process. I guess I didn't think that there was a lot of necessity for that, that if you're ready to go, you should just go. And after going through that with Brent, I really came to see that if indeed someone does go through this several-day process of dying, sometimes it takes people longer. I had a good friend that died, and it took her a couple of weeks, actually, in hospice. And so if you don't have that, well, some people die quickly, obviously. Some people die in car wrecks or die suddenly in accidents. You have the opportunity to engage the dying process, even if it's to help someone who is dying. I think it can be very meaningful. I think there is meaning and purpose to that. And so I still believe that if someone wants assisted suicide, that should certainly be their right. But from my standpoint, as I see it today, and obviously it may change, who knows, I think there is meaning and purpose to this dying process. It's a fascinating process, and it also gave me personally a lot of peace about thoughts of my own death someday.
Yeah. You say that you've learned to think of Brent and of all things on this level of consciousness as either manifest or unmanifest. Everything exists on some level of consciousness, and those we love and lose are merely unmanifest, but they still exist. I think that is a lovely way of describing it.
Yes, that was something that I learned from studying Buddhism, is this idea of what is manifest versus what is unmanifest. And I learned that all is created in the mind by the mind. And that really rang true with me. Once you learn about mind and consciousness and thought and how thoughts are creative, all is created in the mind by the mind. And nothing has any inherent existence from its own side. That comment that I heard our Buddhist teacher say many, many times really rang true with me. And in studying quantum physics, I also learned that nothing has any inherent reality, that truly everything is created in the mind. For anything to exist, it needs an observer. And so we have the observer principle that quantum physicists developed. So I really do believe that that this creative energy that never goes away. Mind is always, we're conscious on some level all the time. That to be manifest and to be unmanifest, it doesn't matter. We're still conscious. And sometimes people can appear to us who've passed on. I've never had that experience, but I know a lot of people have. And I think that's important to realize that everything is created in the mind by the mind. And so this idea of consciousness, of mind, and eternal being is very important to understand. It helps us to live more fearlessly, and certainly it helps us to die without fear.
You became a hospice volunteer after Brent's death. Why did you choose to do that? Was it a way of giving back, or did you feel that Brent's death had given you something that you could offer other people?
Yeah, both of those, I think. I did feel like it was a way to give back. The hospice people and the hospice group that we had selected were really wonderful people. And I really liked the way they embraced death and dying. They sort of just let Brent and I do our own thing. They were there waiting in the wings if we needed them, or they would come by and just check his vitals and so forth periodically. And I thought that was a really wonderful thing. That was my first encounter with a hospice group, and I certainly thought it was wonderful. So it was a way to give back to them, as well as I believed that I could have something to offer others who were dying, and perhaps their families who were taking care of them at home have something to offer them. And I think that was really true. I only volunteered for a couple of years, but it was really a wonderful experience. And I do hope I helped people along the way, because after all, that's what we're here for, to help other people and learn from our own experiences and help them to have a more fearless life too.
Absolutely. We're going to take a brief break now, Claire. You're listening to What Is Going On. I'm Sandie Sedgbeer, and my guest is professional writer, author, and practicing Buddhist Clare Goldsberry. And we're talking about her latest book, The Illusion of Life and Death, Mind, Consciousness, and Eternal Being, in which she draws from her insights as a Buddhist practitioner, her studies of Christianity, ageless wisdom, Hinduism, and her partner's cancer journey, to provide a profound view of living and dying and beyond, as well as what it means to have a good death. We'll be back with more after the break.
The future of Internet radio is here. OMTimes Radio, IOM FM. Being a radio host on IOM FM allows you to build your show on a rich platform with the power of the Internet to fulfill your outreach goals and connect with a very specialized and global online audience, unlimited by time and distance. OMTimes Radio will provide you with web relevance, a recognizable conscious brand, and with the standard of excellence that has accompanied every single OMTimes endeavor. Host your show with OMTimes Radio Network.
Vox Novus, the new voice. Vox Novus, the new dimension. Vox Novus, thought and movement leaders who will share from their experience and offer tools to help us navigate our rapidly changing world. My name is Victor Furman. Join me every Thursday at 8 p.m. Eastern on OMTimes Radio for Vox Novus, the new voice.
Hello, I'm Sandie Sedgbeer, host of OMTimes' flagship radio show, What Is Going On? And my passion is helping people like you find credible answers to your deepest spiritual questions. As an author, editor, TV radio host, and 13 times book judge, I've read thousands of books and interviewed hundreds of authors, so I know what's worth reading and what's not, which is why I founded the No BS Spiritual Book Club, to help you save time and money by picking the brains of discerning names who've walked this path before you. There's no catch, no joining fees, and no BS. Just an ever-growing library of the 10 best spiritual books that helped some of your favourite authors and teachers on their life paths, along with free book excerpts, audios, and video podcasts in which they share the intimate stories behind their lists and their journeys. Regardless of where you're at on your evolutionary journey, you'll find dozens of enlightening and empowering recommendations at the No BS Spiritual Book Club. People like Dan Millman, Don Miguel Ruiz Jr., David G., Yanda Van Sant, Lee Harris, Mark Nepo, Emmanuel Dagger, Diva Primrao, and Meetin, and many more. So why not join the club? It's easy and it's free at the NoBSSpiritualBookClub.com.
Coping-19, brought to you by CDC and the Ad Council.
If you're feeling increasingly lonely right now, you're not alone. It's totally normal. Even though we may not be able to get together in person, connecting virtually with friends and family still gives you a chance to interact with people and may help raise your spirits. Join a virtual book club, set up group text chats, or online video coffee breaks with coworkers.
Find more self-care and coping tips at coping-19.org.
Welcome back. Clare Goldsberry, in The Illusion of Life and Death, you've arranged it in 4 sections. You cover what is life, illness, old age and death, looking deeper into death, and what happens after death. I'd like to have a little dive into each of these, but first, what is the meaning and purpose of life?
That's always the big question, right? What is the meaning and purpose of life? Always. I never will forget, 30 years ago, I was watching Bill Moyers interview Joseph Campbell, the mythologist, and Bill Moyers asked Joseph Campbell, what is the meaning of life? And I thought Campbell's answer was so intriguing that I've never forgotten it. And I've even written some essays about that. He said, life has no inherent meaning. You bring meaning to it. And I thought, how interesting. There's just no meaning of life. You bring meaning to it by what you do, by what you think, by your actions. You bring meaning to it day by day by day. And I thought that was rather telling. So that's what I tell people when they ask me what is the meaning of life. I just quote Joseph Campbell because it really resonated with me, and I think it was a great answer, actually.
Did you discuss that question with Brent?
No, I can't say as I really did. He never really had any questions. It was kind of odd. He just seemed to go with the flow. And it was interesting because in January, just a few months before he died that year, the company that he worked for, they wanted everybody to think of a word that would indicate their hope for that year. And obviously it was, for business, but it could be for personal life too. And Brent asked me what I thought would be a good word for him. And I said, well, obviously the perfect word is flow. If you've ever wondered how someone can go with the flow, literally, I mean, amazingly so, Brent was the perfect ideal for that. Mm. He just was the type that could embrace everything. Nothing got to him. Nothing seemed bad. Nothing seemed discouraging. It was just this flow that he stayed in this zone that life just moved forward. He never questioned it. He never tried to find any meaning to it. It was just his life. And that, to me, was an amazing lesson. Too often, maybe we search too much for what is, or trying to fight things that we see happening to us that we don't like. And yet he never did. He just, go with the flow. It was truly amazing.
Mm. One of the things about your book that surprised me, because I've never come across it before, but also gave me a lot of understanding and peace, was where you were describing as, he was finally letting go, the different stages his body was going through, the way the body, begins to release the, you talked about the senses and the elements and how, his body was letting go of water and then fire and the different elements. And I'd never heard of anything like this before, but it made so much sense for me watching my father-in-law die when, his mouth was so dry, and other people when they don't want to open their eyes. And it's so comforting to have that understanding.
It is, and I recommend highly the Tibetan Book of Living and Dying by Sedgbeer Rinpoche. It's an amazing book. First third is about life. The second third is about the dying process. And the last 1/3 of the book is about the Bardo state, which is obviously in Buddhism the state after death. But that middle section, that description of the dying process, was so amazing. It helped me so much because you're not left wondering, well, what's happening? Like you said, when they start losing the water and their mouth just, and they drool and everything, and then all of a sudden they're so dry, and he needed ice chips all the time. I kept a bowl of ice chips by the bed so that he could reach over and get ice chips. And as the heat retreats and their feet are cold, their legs are cold, their hands are cold, and you think, oh my goodness, they need more blankets, but blankets don't help. It's that the fire in the body, that life force in the body starting to retreat. And I recommend that everybody read the Tibetan Book of Living and Dying, because to me it was the most helpful thing. In fact, one day just before Brent died, I told him, in fact, I think it was the day before he died, I told him, I said, I'm sure glad you died by the book, so I know what was going on. It was like, sometimes we're lucky enough to be around somebody who's dying by the book, but it shows us a lot. I think we have a lot to learn from that.
Would you say that dying by the book is what constitutes a good death, or is that something else?
Well, I think a good death is a death without fear, a death without regrets. I think it's also a death without attachments. I've had experience being around people who were so attached to their bodies, so attached to their material possessions. It's all they thought about. Is, I'm going to have to leave my house. I'm going to have to leave my family. I'm going to have to leave and go somewhere else. And they didn't want to, and they cling to it, and they fight it. And it causes a lot of suffering. I think that's kind of a difficult death. I think a good death is one where you realize that your life is over, that your purpose has come to a close, that all the material things you accumulated throughout your life, your reputation, your families, whatever, has come to a close. And not be afraid to let that go. And I think it's important for the people around them to not be afraid to allow them to let go. One of the hardest things to see, and hospice volunteers often see this, are family members who are standing around their dying loved one, pleading and begging for them not to die, pleading and begging, for the hospice person to do something, call a doctor, when that's not really, in the wheelhouse of hospice. And I think that makes it so much more difficult on the dying person. Again, which is why, while we're living and healthy, we should study these things, the dying process, and what is life, what is death, because that will help. I think this idea of allowing someone to let go. And I think non-attachment is a great practice to learn while we're living. Non-attachment to our body, to our material things. We all identify very strongly with our bodies. And yet when the time comes, people who are so reluctant to leave their bodies, they fight it and fight it. And I think that makes dying more difficult than it needs to be. So I think a lot of these practices can serve us very well in life if we practice these. Then when death comes, we're more ready to embrace death. Yeah.
It's quite eye-opening when you give a lot of the statistics around the cost of dying, or the cost of keeping someone alive at the end of life, and how high it is. And we know they're going to die regardless. And why would we hang on to that? Why would we want to force more of that? Particularly, if to keep them alive is to keep them in pain.
Exactly. And Dr. Kevin Hasselhorst, who I mentioned in the book, I went to a seminar that he gave. He was an emergency room doctor in Scottsdale, and he really laid it on the line. He said everybody needs to have a universal directive, because he said it is so difficult on doctors. He said we have someone, we have the family there. They're saying, keep this person alive, don't let them die. And he said, we know that it's going to cost an exorbitant amount of money. Not that there's a price on anybody's life, but when there is just no hope, and when the person is being treated in ways that is causing them more pain. And that's what Dr. Hasselhorst found the most difficult. In fact, she told the story of one elderly gentleman that when his relatives went out of the room to go get something to eat, he grabbed Dr. Hasselhorst by the arm and said, "Please, don't hurt me anymore. Don't do anything else to me." So I think that that's something that we all need to consider, that, are we extending the person's life when they really don't want it? But maybe they're afraid to tell their family, "I don't want this. I don't want this anymore." And I think it makes it more difficult for everybody. It's hard on the doctors. It's hard on the family. It's hard on the patient. And that's why I truly believe that learning about life and death is so critical to helping us have a good life and also to have a good death, one without fear.
Yes. In your section on after death, I made a little note, and I don't know whether this was, I'm just going to quote something, whether this came from you or whether you were quoting someone else, but it is said that our karma, our immortal identity, including traits and personality features, will be stored in the cosmic mind as seeds that will be the basis for future existences. We are creating our future lives in this present lifetime, and death offers us an entrance into yet another opportunity for spiritual advancement. I think that's a beautiful statement.
Well, thank you. It's something I learned in studying Buddhism and attending a Sangha for 6 years. Yes, it does offer us. It offers us lessons. It's a way that we can learn. Read that one section again. I had a thought in my mind and I lost it when you said
it is said that our karma, our immortal identity, traits and personality features will be stored in the cosmic mind as seeds.
Yes, that's it, yeah. In the storehouse. The mind is actually a storehouse. The mind is the storehouse of everything, all of our thoughts, words, and deeds, and it does help us in our future lives. It's been said that if you want to know what your past life is like, look at your present life. If you want to know what your future life is like, look at your present life, because we are always creating. We have created, we continue to create, and the mind is a storehouse of all that we create. And the idea of karma, which just means action in Sanskrit, is that we are always creating karma. And karma is often misunderstood. It's not retribution. It's not, not about good or bad. It's about our actions of body, speech, and mind. And all of those actions go into creating our next life, just as they work at creating this life.
Yes, yeah. You will also say in the book that if we ever thought there could be a meeting of the minds between science and spirituality, you believe it lies in quantum physics and the Eastern philosophies, because the paths between them are quite parallel.
Yes, they are. I was truly amazed when I started studying Buddhism. And then I was reading a book that actually got me to thinking about science. And so I started looking into that. And the first book I ever picked up in a bookstore was one called Bridging Science and Spirit. And it was written by a quantum physicist who also knew about the Eastern philosophies. And all of a sudden it began to click with me. And all of these things I was learning in my Buddhist studies, I could see these parallels in quantum physics. And it just amazed me so much that I began this long journey into looking at these parallels between the Eastern philosophies, which includes Hinduism too, obviously, and quantum physics, because it answered so many questions that I had. And it also helps connect everything. And so instead of a lot of religious people don't go along with the science idea of certain things. I think that what we need is a synthesis between science and spiritual traditions, because I think that would really help us understand more about life and death and about why we're here, and help us on the path, really.
Yeah. Yeah, there was another piece that I made a particular note of. You say that Sri Chinmoy says that when we live in the soul, there is no such thing as death. There's just a constant evolution of our consciousness. The soul does not forget to carry with it the essence of the experiences that it acquired while it was in the land of the living. While taking its rest, it assimilates the essence of its past. When the assimilation is over, it starts to prepare itself for a new journey. Birth and death are inseparable. They are the two covers of the book whose contents we call life.
Yes, it's so true that everything we do, it's never wasted. It's never forgotten. It's always there. We're in this stream. It's like the stream of life. You've heard people compare a stream that empties into the river, that empties into the ocean, and it's just this continual stream. And I think it's so important to be able to look at our lives as a stream, to look at everything we do, be aware of everything we do. It's so important to be aware of all of our actions, body, speech, and mind, and go into this stream that will carry our consciousness throughout all of our lifetimes. And it's never really forgotten. It's always there. We have memories that we don't even know we have, because it's part of that stream of lifetimes past that will enter into lifetimes future as the stream enters the river and the river enters into the ocean.
Mm. You teach introductory classes on Buddhism, Hinduism, Kabbalah, Gnosticism, ageless wisdom traditions, theosophy, Christianity in America, the Second Great Awakening, Mormonism, Transcendentalism, and New Thought for the Maricopa County Community College in Phoenix, Arizona, and at the New Vision Center for Spiritual Living. Are you finding, and maybe it's a little bit too soon to tell, but that since COVID, more people are awakening and wanting to know an awful lot more about life and about death as well, and certainly about consciousness?
Right. Oh, I think so. I really do. I've had so many people write to me about the book, that they've recently purchased it, and they say it's been so helpful. Never before has death been thrown out at us so overtly as it has in these past 2 years. And I had one woman back on the East Coast who works in hospice, and she's also a Zen Buddhist teacher. And she emailed me and said, wow, she said, do we ever need this? And that was such a compliment. And I do think it's true. I think that in the world we're living in now, if we don't learn about life and about death and how to have a good death, how to have a fearless life so we can have a fearless death, I don't know how people get through it without understanding these more esoteric things about life and death.
It's interesting to me that, there was a time 10, 15 years ago where you really couldn't sell a book about death because nobody wanted to go there. But over the past 5 or 6 years, I have seen dozens of books appearing, and it's as if, we're being prepared maybe for COVID, or the consciousness is just shifting, and the time is now right for us to be looking at this.
Well, I think you're right. I really do. I think the consciousness has shifted. I think that people we're definitely being prepared for something, because you're right. There's just all these books about death. And I know when I was looking through book stores online and so forth, I couldn't believe all the books on death. I was trying to come up with a title for my book, and it's like, oh my goodness, I think every title has been taken, And I do think that we're much more aware, and I think that's a good thing. I've always said that out of good things, bad things can happen, and out of really bad things, good things can come. And I really believe that's true.
If there's only one thing that you want people to take from this book, what would it be?
Well, I think it was Brent's final words to me. And I would like to leave people with that. And that is, he said, dying is easy. He said, I thought it would be harder than this, but it really is so easy. And an hour or so later, he slipped away. And I thought about that. I've held that really close, because that's something we have to somehow embrace and believe that. But I think it happens to very special people, like Brent was. He lived a fearless life and wasn't bothered by his cancer diagnosis. And I think that's really important, that to remember that dying is easy. But I think it's something we also have to prepare for. I don't think for most people it just happens automatically.
Mm. Do you think that having lived through Brent's illness and his death, even knowing what you knew before from your studies, that now you really have a different perspective on death, and that it will be so much easier
definitely.
for you?
Yes, definitely. It really did. Like I said, you can read about it, you can intellectualize it, but until you're confronted with it, I don't think you can really understand how important it is to really embrace those ideas of living and dying and consciousness and mind. I think that's so important. And yes, it has changed my perspective very much.
Well, Clare Goldsberry, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Sandie. I appreciate it.
Oh, you're welcome. The Illusion of Life and Death, Mind, Consciousness and Eternal Being by Clare Goldsberry is published by Monkfoot Book Publishing. You can order it from your local bookstore or online. And for more information about Clare and her work, visit her website, claregoldsberry.com, which is ClareGoldsberry. And the book covers such topics as karma and reincarnation, suffering, living consciously, understanding consciousness and reality, the mind, learning to embrace what is, non-attachment versus detachment, the business of illness and the cost of keeping us alive, as well as dying with grace and dignity, and suicide. And it really is, it may sound as though it's a grim topic. Actually, the book is really thought-provoking and very, very good. You can also find out more information about the No BS Spiritual Book Club and my weekly live streaming interviews with some of your favourite authors, speakers and teachers on my website at sedgbeer.com. And if you know you have a book in you but don't know how to get it out of your head and into the world's hands, click on the Work With Me tab and find out how my experience helping others tell their stories might be the catalyst you've been looking for. That brings us to the end of this week's show. I'm Sandie Sedgbeer, and I'll be back at the same time next week with another edition of What Is Going On. Till then, it's goodbye from me.